They told me I had been dead for 11 days. I didn't feel dead. I felt the cold of the sheet against the backs of my legs, the antiseptic bite of recycled air in my nose, a ceiling of white polymer tiles pressing down on me like a lid. I felt the dull throb in my right temple where the interface port had been sutured, and I felt underneath all of it, beneath the soreness and the disorientation and the faint pharmaceutical haze, a hole, a shape the size of a person, not a wound exactly. More like the outline of something that had been there and wasn't anymore. My mother was the first face I saw. She was seated at the foot of the bed, dressed in gray, the circle always dressed in gray, or something close to it, muted colors that whispered authority without shouting it. Her hair was perfect. It was always perfect. I had grown up watching her calibrate every aspect of her presentation before she entered any room, the way a craftsman checks his tools before beginning work. Her hands were folded in her lap with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent years learning to project calm as a professional posture. She looked relieved in the way someone looks relieved when a problem has been solved, not in the way someone looks relieved when a person they love has returned from somewhere terrible. "Thomas," she said, "welcome back." I tried to sit up. My arms shook. They were my arms. I recognized the scar on my left forearm from a cutting accident on the Veda platform 7 years back, but they shook more than I expected. The musculature had been laid in recently. The nervous pathways were still negotiating with the flesh. "How long?" I asked. 11 days since the procedure." She stood, moved to the side of the bed, adjusted something on the IV line without looking at me while she did it. A habit she had always preferred doing to looking. "You were gone for nearly 48 hours before we were able to retrieve you. The backup window is 72, so there is some memory loss. A small gap. That's normal. You'll settle into continuity quickly. The medics say most people integrate within a week." I lay back and looked at the ceiling. 48 hours. 2 days gone from the tape. I tried to find the edge of it, the way you probe a dark room with your foot before you step in. I could feel the gap there, like a step that wasn't where you expected it to be. Tuesday evening, I was in a transit hub on the lower ring. I had been heading somewhere. I could feel the intention of it, the direction, but not the destination. And there was urgency in it. Not panic, but the controlled urgency of a person who has realized something and knows that the window for acting on it is limited and is moving accordingly. I could feel the shape of that urgency without being able to recover its cause. Then, nothing. Then this room. Memory gaps from momentization were common enough that the medics had a whole taxonomy for them. Procedural variants, they called the small ones, a few minutes, an hour, sometimes a full night, usually just the period immediately before death when the body's own systems were failing, and the recorded signal was degrading. Substantive gaps, anything over 6 hours, were rarer, occurred mostly in cases where the body had been in poor condition for an extended period before recovery. A 48-hour gap was on the outer edge of the range, but not unheard of. What was unusual was the feeling that the gap mattered, that there was something inside it that needed to be recovered, not grieved and moved past. "What happened to me?" I said. "An accident." She said it cleanly, no hesitation, no drop in the eyes. 11 days of practice. "You went into the lower sectors without a security detail. You know the statistics, Thomas, the unlicensed zones." "Mother..." She stopped. "What happened to me?" I said again, slower. She looked at me then. That gray-blue gaze she had, level and controlled. She had been a senior administrator with the New Life Directorate for 23 years. She did not flinch. She did not stumble. "You were attacked," she said. "The circumstances are still being reviewed. What matters is that we got to you in time and that the momentization was clean. Your identity profile registered at 97.4% coherence. That is exceptional, Thomas. You are, in every meaningful sense, yourself." In every meaningful sense. I held that phrase for a while after she left. She had given me water, had adjusted my pillow, had spoken to the duty medic in a low voice outside the door. I caught only fragments, something about integration intervals and the follow-up schedule, and then she was gone. The room settled into the quiet hum of its own machinery. I tried to find Kazu. That was the name at the bottom of the hole. I didn't arrive at it logically. I didn't reconstruct it from context. It surfaced the way certain things surface when you are neither fully awake nor fully asleep, complete and certain and already there, waiting. Kazu. The line of his jaw, the way he laughed with his whole face, the particular frequency of his voice when he said my name. Thomas. Not the polished version, not the performance, my name, plain and specific, from someone who meant it. I knew, in the way you know things in the body before the mind catches up, that he was why I had gone into the lower sectors. I knew in the same way that my mother knew it too. The New Life facility was on the 6th ring of the Veda orbital habitat, which had been humanity's administrative center for just under 4 decades, ever since the architects had made the surface of the planet a contested zone. That is what we called them, the architects. Our name for them, not theirs. They had never, as far as any communication had established, given themselves a name at all. They did not appear to think of themselves as a category. They were simply what intelligence looked like when it had run several million years longer than ours, and had shed every limitation we still considered fundamental. Body, mortality, the friction of individual experience. They had arrived in the inner system without warning, without theater, without any of the invasion ceremonies our old fiction had taught us to expect. No bombardment, no ultimatums transmitted from towering warships. They had simply begun modifying things. Atmospheric processors, orbital manufacturing platforms, the deep-sea thermal arrays that powered the equatorial cities. They altered each installation precisely, minimally, the way an engineer corrects a design flaw. Humans were not killed. Infrastructure was not destroyed, it was adjusted. When we asked what they wanted, they gave us answers that took 6 weeks to translate and still didn't resolve into anything our category of wanting could process. When we tried to refuse the alterations, equipment simply stopped working until the alterations were accepted. When we sent armed missions to reclaim modified stations, the weapons discharged without producing any of their intended effects, and the soldiers returned with their gear intact, and their memories gapped, small, surgical gaps, 48 to 72 hours, like the one I was waking up in now. The architects, we eventually understood, were managing us, not destroying us, not enslaving us in any theatrical sense. Managing, the way you manage a garden, the way you redirect a river. They had been doing it for a long time before we noticed, and they had been doing it for 19 years since we did notice, and as far as anyone in the circle could determine, they intended to continue indefinitely. The word most researchers settled on for what they were was post-biological, not robotic. That implied a designed artifact, something with a maker and a purpose external to itself. Not simply ancient. Age alone doesn't explain the nature of the difference. Post-biological meant that whatever evolutionary or developmental path had produced them, it had passed through the phase of being embodied and localized and individual, and had continued past it, the way a river passes through rapids and continues as something calmer and broader and harder to see the shape of. They had no bodies we could locate. They had no home system anyone had identified. They communicated, when they communicated, in a mathematical structure that our best linguists and information theorists had been working on for 19 years, and had gotten approximately 40% of the way through, if their confidence estimates were honest. The 40% they understood was mostly structural. The content, the meaning, remained largely opaque. What they were managing us toward, no one had figured out. The circle was the stratum of society with access to momentization, the procedure that backed up your memory signature, encoded it, and implanted it in a cloned body if the original died. It was the closest thing to immortality that human engineering had produced, and it was expensive beyond the imagining of anyone outside the circle's membership rolls. My mother had made sure I was on those rolls from the time I was old enough for the initial scan. She was thorough in that way. She had plans for me the way the architects had plans for the orbital arrays, long horizon, patient, and fundamentally not mine to approve or refuse. I lay in that bed for 2 more days before I was cleared for ambulatory activity. I used the time to map the gap. The backup had been pulled from the port 48 hours before my body was recovered. That meant 2 days of experience simply didn't exist in the version of me that had woken in this room. 2 days in the lower sectors. I had gone there to find Kazo. I knew that now as a fact, though I couldn't retrieve the memory of deciding it. The lower sectors were the unlicensed zones, the parts of the orbital ring that operated outside the circle's administrative envelope, outside the architect's modified infrastructure, outside most of the laws that the habitats held to. They were crowded and poorly lit, and they smelled of machine grease and fermented grain mash, and the particular unwashed human odor that comes from high-density living with intermittent water access. And they were the only place in the habitat where you could genuinely disappear. My mother had told me Kazo didn't exist, not in those words. She had said when I asked directly on the second day that I was likely confusing a memory from before the gap with some neural echo from the procedure. Integration artifacts, she called them. The mind fills its holes, Thomas. It reaches for familiar shapes. You may find yourself remembering people who are composites, or events that are emotional residue rather than literal record. She was lying. I knew she was lying the way I knew Kazo's name in the body, underneath the reasoning. On the 3rd day I got up, dressed in the clothes that had been laid out for me, circle gray, naturally, and walked out of the recovery wing while the duty medic was occupied elsewhere. The transit system that connected the inner rings to the lower sectors ran on a different grid from the circle's network, which meant my circle-registered movement chip would flag the moment I stepped into a lower sector terminal. I had 40 minutes, maybe 60, before my mother's people would have a physical location on me. I used 8 of those minutes getting to the exchange point at Ring 4, where you could trade circle credits for unlicensed currency at a rate that would have offended anyone with financial training, and where a vendor who asked no questions sold me a null sleeve, a biometric wrap for the wrist that scrambled the movement chip's signal into background noise. The vendor was old, mid-70s maybe. He had the look of a man who had been in the lower sectors long enough that the lower sectors had become his face. He fitted the null sleeve without looking at me, and when he was done he said, without inflection, "Your circle." "Yes," I said. "You look recently processed." 11 days out. He nodded once like he was checking a box. "They do clean work, you'd almost never know." He paused. "Whatever you lost, it's probably gone. They're careful about that." I paid him. I went into the lower sectors. The difference in atmosphere was immediate and total. The circle's rings were engineered for calm, light levels, acoustic dampening. Even the airflow had been optimized by architect-modified processors to reduce stress markers in the resident population. You breathed easier in the circle, literally, and that ease was not an accident. It was a design choice, and like all their design choices, it was so rational and thorough that refusing it felt like refusing to wear shoes. The lower sectors were noise and friction, and the specific vitality that comes from systems nobody maintains properly. The deck plating vibrated from the weight of foot traffic. Stall vendors shouted. Children ran between adult legs without apology. The air smelled of food being cooked in improvised kitchens, of metal being worked, of 100 separate lives proceeding without administrative coordination. I moved through it trying to look purposeful without looking directed. A man just arrived, still finding his bearings. That was the character I needed to play. It wasn't difficult. I didn't have much bearings to find. The name that kept surfacing alongside Kazo's was a place. The Hacker's Lounge. That was what the lower sectors called it, though it had a proper designation somewhere in the unlicensed network directories. It was a virtual access node, one of several dozen in the lower ring, where people who couldn't afford legal network time came to access the habitat's information infrastructure through non-sanctioned terminals. More than that, it was a social architecture, a space where the digital presence of people who didn't officially exist could interact with the physical world in whatever limited way a terminal and a good network pirate could arrange. I didn't know why I was looking for it. I knew only that I was, the same way I knew Kazu's name. It took me most of the afternoon. The lounge occupied a decommissioned water reclamation subsection on Ring 3, back behind a corridor that the habitat's official schematics still listed as undergoing maintenance. The terminal operators had been running out of this space for years, possibly decades. The equipment was layered, generations of hardware retrofitted onto older hardware, a geological cross-section of salvage technology, and the lighting was amber and low, and there were perhaps 30 people in the space when I entered, some at terminals, some simply present in the way people are present in a place that is theirs. The man at the central console looked up when I came in. He was younger than me by perhaps a decade, dark-featured, wearing the patched jacket that seemed to serve as a uniform of the lower rings. He had an engineer's hands, scarred along the knuckles, nails cut short and practical, and the quality of alertness of someone who had spent years operating in spaces where the wrong kind of inattentiveness got you hurt. He assessed me in about 2 seconds, his gaze moving from my face to my wrist to my shoes and back. The null sleeve apparently passed. "Looking for access time," he said. "Looking for someone," I said. "Kazu." The man's face did something small and quick that was not quite a reaction. "Don't know the name," he said. "I think you do." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said at a lower register, "You're Thomas Steiner." "Yes." "You look different." "I am different, 11 days." He let that land. The people at the nearby terminals were not looking at us, which in a space this size meant they were listening very carefully. "My name is Louis," he said. "We should sit down." What Louis told me took the better part of an hour, and I will try to reconstruct it faithfully, though some of what he said I couldn't process cleanly in the moment and had to return to later, in quieter circumstances, to properly understand. Kaz was not a person who existed in any physical sense anymore. That was the first thing, and it was the foundation everything else rested on. Kazo had been real. He had lived in the lower sectors, had worked as a network technician, had met Thomas Steiner, the previous Thomas Steiner, the one whose body was now presumably in whatever disposal process the Circle used, approximately 14 months before my death. They had been, without any formal designation, together. Whatever that word contains. The entirety of what it contains, which is more than any administrative category was designed to hold. He had been, from what Louis described, a careful man. Not cautious in the sense of someone who avoids risk, cautious in the sense of someone who takes risks deliberately and with clear eyes. He had grown up in the lower sectors, had taught himself network architecture from salvage documentation and practical trial and error, had built a reputation in the lounge as someone whose work was reliable, and whose judgment about what was actually happening in the habitat's data infrastructure was better than almost anyone operating without institutional backing. He had been the kind of person who notices things, who notices that a pattern is a pattern rather than noise, even before he can name what the pattern means. 3 weeks before my death, Kazo had also died. His death had been ruled an accident by the Habitat's administration office, a pressure seal failure in one of the Ring 2 maintenance corridors, fast and final. The difference between Kazo's death and mine was that Kazo was not Circle. There was no backup. There was no body waiting in a recovery bay at the New Life facility, gently warmed and ready for its new occupant. Kazo's death was simply his death, which is to say it was the only kind of death that is actually death, the kind with no administrative solution. Louis let me sit with that for a while before he continued. What he said next was the part I had to return to later. Kazo had, in the weeks before his death, become involved with the lounge's network operations, not as a casual user, as a researcher. He had been accessing architect infrastructure through the non-sanctioned terminals, looking for something specific, looking, as near as Louis and the others could reconstruct, for the mechanism by which the architects interfaced with New Life's momentization records. Because Kazo had found something, or believed he had found something, he had told Louis in fragments about an anomaly in the momentization data, a pattern in which certain memory profiles were not simply backed up and returned upon death, but were edited during the procedure. Small edits, targeted, not erasure but sculpting, the way you shape clay, pressing here, smoothing there, until the form the clay takes matches what you had in mind from the beginning. And the pattern Kazo had identified, the organizing logic of the edits, was consistent with architect behavioral signatures. The same minimal precision, the same long-horizon patience, the same disregard for the individual's experience of the change. He thought they were using New Life, Louis said. Not building it, not running it, they've never needed to control infrastructure directly, but using it, the way you'd use a tool you didn't design. He thought they had worked out that momentization gave them a specific capability. What capability? I asked. Iteration, Louis said. Every time someone goes through the procedure, they come back slightly different, statistically within error tolerances, within what the medics call normal integration variance. But if you're making the edits and you have enough iterations and enough time, he stopped. You can reshape a person without them knowing, without them being able to point at the moment it happened. They just integrate. They settle into continuity. That's the language they use, right? Settle, like silt. I thought of my mother's face at the foot of the recovery bed, her folded hands, her relief that read like problem solved rather than person returned. I thought of her voice. In every meaningful sense, you are yourself. Kazo started to figure out what edits had been made to specific people, I said. People in the circle. He was starting to. He got partway. He found one profile he was confident about. Louis looked at me steadily. Yours. I went back to the lounge 3 more times over the following week. I told no one in the circle where I was going. My null sleeve held. My mother sent one message, then a second, the language in both messages calibrated to sound like concern rather than pressure, though the pressure was legible underneath it if you knew where to look. I didn't reply. What Kazo had been building, in the weeks before he died, was a mapping tool. He had been documenting the architecture of architect infrastructure access points, places where their influence touched New Life systems, the seams where 2 incompatible engineering philosophies had been forced into dialogue. The lounge's network operators had access to non-sanctioned pathways through the habitat's data infrastructure, routes that weren't logged in the official system, maintained by 3 decades of pirate engineering and institutional disobedience. Kazo had been using those pathways to map the architect access points. He hadn't finished. He had left behind a partial map and enough documentation for Louis and 2 other people in the lounge to continue the work, if they understood what they were looking at. The problem was they didn't understand what they were looking at. They were excellent network technicians. They were not people who had studied architect behavioral and operational signatures, which was a discipline that barely existed outside the circle's own research institutions, and which I had spent the better part of 8 years studying before my death and resurrection. That was, I slowly came to understand, why the previous Thomas Steiner had come to the lower sectors. Not only for Kazo, for this. Louis gave me Kazo's documentation without ceremony. A data chip, physically small, the kind of thing you could lose in a coat pocket and never find again. He set it on the table between us. He said you'd know what to do with it, Louis said. He told you that. Before he died, he said, if this goes wrong and Steiner eventually comes looking, Give him everything and tell him to trust what he knows over what he thinks he remembers. I picked up the chip. It was warm from Louis's pocket. Trust what he knows over what he thinks he remembers. The gap in my memory was 48 hours wide. Whatever the previous Thomas Steiner had decided in that 48 hours, whatever he had seen or confirmed or planned was gone. What remained was the emotional residue, the certainty about Kazo, the directional pull toward the lounge, the feeling of having somewhere to be and someone to find. The body's memory, which doesn't encode in the same architecture as the mind and doesn't respond to the same editing tools. I took the chip. I put it in my inside pocket. I sat in the amber light of the lounge for a while, among people who had made their lives in the spaces between administered existence, and I thought about Silt. The map Kazo had built was incomplete, but it was coherent. He had been a methodical man. I could tell that from the documentation, the precision of his notation, the care he took to distinguish confirmed observations from inferences. It was the work of someone who understood that the difference between what you know and what you suspect is not a minor distinction. It is everything. He had dated each entry. He had cross-referenced his observations against multiple access points before recording a pattern as confirmed. He had flagged, explicitly and in a separate section, the places where he was working beyond his training and where an expert in architect operational signatures should verify what he had found. He had known his own limits and had annotated them carefully, which is a rarer quality than it should be. The architect access points he had identified were distributed across the New Life infrastructure in a pattern that only became visible when you overlaid it with a behavioral model. Taken individually, each access point looked like a maintenance interface, a data relay, a standard inter-system protocol handshake. Taken together with the behavioral model applied, they described something that had the structure of a sensory system. Not passive monitoring, active engagement. The architects were not simply reading New Life's data. They were participating in its processes, the way a musician participates in a composition rather than recording it. I had 8 years of studying their behavioral signatures. I had spent those years in the Circle's research facilities, working from sanitized datasets and approved observation logs, which meant I had been working at one remove from the actual signal, but the underlying patterns were the same. I recognized them the way you recognize a voice you have heard before, even in a new language. The cadence, the economy, the preference for intervention that leaves no obvious mark. I had not recognized them in New Life's architecture before because I had not known to look, and because the overlap between architect operational methodology and standard human biodata processing protocols was not obvious unless you were already intimately familiar with both. Once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The editing mechanism Kaz had hypothesized was real. It operated at the memory integration stage of the momentization procedure. The 12 to 18-hour window after the backed-up profile is loaded into the clone body, when the mind is consolidating recovered experience into the new neural architecture. The window when the medics say you are settling into continuity. The architects had found a way to introduce modifications during that window that the mind would read as its own integration process, not foreign material, native. The silt analogy was not Kazo's, it was mine, but I understood immediately why it had surfaced. You don't feel the river changing when you are the riverbed. I found the record of my own procedure in Kazo's documentation, partially decoded. He had gotten far enough to see the shape of the edit but not its specific content. What he had seen was enough to confirm it had been made, and enough to identify the pathway it had been routed through. A pathway that ran, at one end through an architect access point, and at the other end, through an administrative account in the Circle's New Life directorate. My mother's account. I sat with that for a long time. She had not acted alone. She couldn't have. The access required multiple authorization layers, and the architect interface required a kind of technical literacy that my mother, for all her administrative capability, did not possess. She had been an instrument, a human instrument in a process that had been designed elsewhere for purposes that were not hers. I didn't know if she understood that. I didn't know if it mattered whether she understood it. What I knew was this. Something had been taken from me during my procedure, and it had been done through her account, and Kazo had died trying to bring me evidence of it, and I had died, or the previous iteration of me had died, probably for the same reason. In every meaningful sense, you are yourself. I wondered what they had tried to remove. I wondered what they had succeeded in removing. I could feel the gap, but I couldn't see into it, couldn't determine whether the missing 48 hours were the only thing gone, or whether there was something else, something older, that had been smoothed away without producing any gap I could measure because it had been integrated so perfectly that my mind had adopted it as its own. The way you manage a garden. Louis had a contact in Ring 2, a woman named Vashti, who had spent 11 years maintaining the non-sanctioned pathway network, and who had, over those 11 years, built a working knowledge of architect-compatible data architecture that no institution in the circle had sanctioned, funded, or recognized. She was in her 50s, and had the quality of extreme patience that comes from spending a decade doing work that will probably never be publicly acknowledged. She was not alarmed by what I showed her. She was interested, which is a different thing. He got close, she said, looking at Kazo's documentation. She meant Kazo. He was missing the inversion layer here and here, but he had the right instinct. He was navigating by instinct towards something he didn't have the framework to fully decode. Can you finish the map? I asked. I can extend it. I don't know if it has an end. She looked up. What are you going to do with it when we have it? It was a fair question. I had been asking myself the same thing since I left the New Life facility. The obvious answer, report it, escalate it, bring evidence of architect interference in the momentization process to the Circle's institutional oversight, was also the obvious failure mode. The Circle's institutional oversight was what my mother administered. Its data infrastructure was what the architects had been working inside for an indeterminate period. Evidence brought through official channels had to survive passing through hands whose condition I could not verify. I'm going to make it impossible to ignore, I said, or impossible to deny. That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one. She looked at me for a moment with the level appraisal of someone who has had to take many risks over many years, and has learned to distinguish between the risks worth taking and the ones that will simply get you killed. Your man, she said, Kazo, he knew this was dangerous. Yes. He did it anyway. Yes. Because of you, partly. I didn't answer. All right, she said, and turned back to the documentation. Give me 3 days. She gave me 4, which was 1 more day than she had promised and 2 fewer than I was afraid it might take. What she produced was a complete map of the architect access points in the New Life system, 37 interface nodes, distributed across the procedural chain from initial backup to final integration, with full documentation of the data routing and the specific process signatures that distinguished architect-influenced operations from standard New Life protocols. More than that, she had found something Kazo hadn't reached. The edits were logged, not in New Life's own records, those had been sanitized, but in the architect access infrastructure itself, in a data layer that operated on a compression logic that no human system had been designed to read, but which Vashti had spent 4 years reverse engineering for exactly this kind of retrieval. The architects logged everything. Everything. The logs were not stored for human consumption, and they were not stored in any location that human regulatory frameworks had considered or covered, but they existed, and Vashti could read them. There were 1,014 logged edit events across the Circle's momentization records over the past 19 years. 1,014 individuals whose returned selves were not entirely the selves who had departed. I was on the list. So were 47 other current members of the Circle's administrative core. So were 6 senior researchers in the Architect Behavioral Study Group. So were several military commanders whose names I recognized from public records of failed resistance efforts. And so was my mother, 13 years ago. An iteration I had never known about, had never been told about, because she had settled into continuity so naturally, as she always told me people did, and had never thought to question it. I sat very still for a while after Vashti showed me that entry. She didn't say anything. She had enough experience with the moment when a person has to absorb something that reorganizes everything they thought they knew about their own history. My mother had not been acting against me. She had been acting as herself, with whatever herself had been shaped into. The architects did not recruit collaborators. They didn't need to. They simply adjusted the people who were already in the positions they needed adjusted, and those people proceeded to act in accordance with their adjusted understanding, and it looked from the inside exactly like conviction. She had believed she was helping me. She had genuinely believed it. That was, I think, the thing I had to grieve before I could do anything else. Getting the documentation out of the lower sectors, and into a form that the Circle's residual independent institutions could access without passing through compromised channels, required the kind of logistical problem-solving that I had not done since my military service, before I went into academic research, before the war settled into the bureaucratic slow grinding it had become. It required calling on people I had not spoken to in years, trading on relationships I had let grow cold, accepting favors I would be expected to repay in some form I couldn't yet predict, and working within time constraints that assumed everything would go wrong at least once, because everything always goes wrong at least once, and the difference between plans that survive contact and plans that don't is whether the planner built the failure modes in from the beginning. Louis helped without being asked. He had known Caso, which meant he had known, longer than I had, what was at stake. He didn't explain himself, and I didn't ask him to. Vashti helped with conditions attached, conditions I found entirely reasonable, which is to say they required me to commit to specific accountability structures and specific protections for the lower sector operators involved, in writing, filed with an independent party who had no connection to the Circle's administrative hierarchy. She had been operating in unofficial space for 11 years and had learned to translate trust into architecture. It was, I thought, the correct way to do business. 2 of the lounge's network operators, a pair of brothers whose names I never learned properly because they went by system handles, helped with the technical architecture of getting the data to 24 redundant locations simultaneously, so that no single interdiction could remove it from circulation. They worked through the night without complaint, fueled by what appeared to be an industrial quantity of strong tea, speaking to each other in the compressed shorthand of people who have been doing the same work together for long enough that they've developed a private language for it. We planned for 5 days. We executed in a single night. The documentation package went out through 11 non-sanctioned pathways. 17 Circle internal relay nodes that Vashti had confirmed were not architect adjacent. 3 encrypted channels to independent researchers outside the habitat entirely, and a compressed data burst sent through a modification to the habitat's public communications array that the brothers accomplished in 40 minutes of work that would have taken a Circle-authorized team 4 days to approve and 12 to complete. At the same time, I walked into the Circle's administrative review board through the front entrance, on my own authority as a Circle member in good standing, and I sat down in front of the chair of the Independent Oversight Committee, a man I had met twice before my death, a man whose name was notably absent from Vashti's log, and I told him everything I knew. He was in his late 60s, a legal background originally, then administrative theory, then oversight. He had the quality that certain people develop over a long career of reviewing institutions for their failures, a particular stillness when receiving information, a refusal to let his face resolve into an expression before he had fully processed what he was hearing. Some people mistake that quality for coldness. It isn't coldness. It's the discipline of a man who has learned that his first reaction is not always his most accurate one, and who has trained himself accordingly. Not everything I could prove. Not yet. Everything I knew. The shape of it. Kazo's work, Vashti's extension of it, the logs, the 1014, the administrative accounts, the editing mechanism, the pattern and its probable purpose, the long-horizon patience of something that thought in timescales we didn't have cultural architecture to properly conceptualize. He listened without interrupting, which took discipline, because what I was telling him reorganized everything he had assumed about the nature of his own governance role and the reliability of the colleagues around him. When I finished, he said, "Can you prove this?" "By the time you finish asking me that question," I said, 31 independent parties will have received a copy of the documentation. You can verify every element against the New Life procedural records. The architect infrastructure logs require a proprietary decryption approach developed by an independent analyst in the lower sectors. I can provide that methodology and the analyst herself as a technical witness. You will have what you need to verify. The question of whether you will verify it is yours to answer. He was quiet for a long time. "Then your mother?" "Yes," I said. "She's been 13 years ago. She did not know, she has not known. Whatever she has done since then, she has done as someone who believed she was acting on her own judgment." I paused. "I'd like that to be taken into account." He nodded once, slowly, in the way a man nods when the weight of a thing has fully arrived. "My mother came to me 3 days after the review board initiated its process. She didn't come officially. She came in the early morning to the small ringside apartment where I had been staying since leaving the New Life facility, and she knocked like a visitor rather than an administrator, which was a thing I noticed. I opened the door. She looked as she always looked, controlled, gray-clothed, level-eyed. But she had also been crying, or had been close to it, recently enough that the evidence was still in her face. "You should have told me," she said. "I know." "I would have," she stopped. She tried again. "I didn't know, Thomas, whatever you found, whatever you think I know you didn't know," I said. "I know." She came in. I made her tea because it was what there was to make, and we sat across from each other at the small table by the viewport, where you could see the upper arc of the habitat's rotation arm, and beyond it the permanent dark of open space, and we were quiet for a while. "They've been adjusting people for 19 years, she said at last. "At least. Toward what purpose?" "We don't know yet. The researchers are working with the operational logs. It's slow. The compression logic is, I thought of Vashti, patient and thorough in the amber light of her workspace. Someone is working on it." "And you," my mother looked at me, "what did they take from you?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it at length, and I had not arrived at a clean answer. I don't know. The edit to my profile happened during this procedure, this most recent one, before I woke up and before I could form any memory that would tell me what had been changed. The gap in my backup covers whatever I learned in the lower sectors before I died, and the edit covers something that was being modified. I paused. I can feel the shape of it. I can't read what was inside. She looked at her hands around the cup. "There is a procedure," she said quietly, "technically possible. The review board's senior medic confirmed it when I asked him yesterday. A full raw state comparison, the pre-procedure scan against the current integration. It can identify edited regions. It can't restore them, but it can tell you what was changed." "I know," I said. "Will you do it?" I looked out the viewport. The dark was unchanged and total and indifferent, the way it always was. Something out there, or rather something that didn't require a location the way we required a location, had been working on humanity for 2 decades at minimum, editing us toward whatever form it found more suitable, and it had been patient and precise and almost entirely invisible, and it had come very close to succeeding without anyone noticing. Almost. Kazo came close, I said. He died coming close. I don't know what I owe him. I don't know how to quantify it. But I know he spent the last weeks of his life working on this, and the reason he started was what they were doing to me, and he did that because I stopped. Because whatever exact word fits there, I didn't have a right to put it in his mouth. Yes, my mother said, very softly. Whatever they took from me, I said, whatever they tried to smooth away, I already know what it was. I can feel what it was, what it is. I looked at her. They didn't get all of it. They left the shape. And the shape is what drove everything that came after. The shape is why I'm in this room instead of that recovery ward. You can't edit someone's bones. You can only edit the memory of them. She was quiet. They miscalculated, I said. Whatever they were trying to remove, they left the root system intact. 19 years of this and they still don't understand how deep it runs. That specific, irrational, unrepeatable whatever this is. This. I touched the place in my chest where the hole had been, which was not a hole anymore. They can't model it. They can't replicate it. They can't erase it completely without destroying everything it's connected to. And everything it's connected to is too much of what makes a person function to touch without creating damage they can detect. My mother was looking at me with something in her face that I had not seen there before. Not relief. Something longer than that. They've been making us more manageable, she said. More predictable. More compatible with their model of what we should be. Yes. And the thing they can't manage is this, what you're describing. They've been pruning the parts of us that are messy and specific and don't generalize, I said. And what's left is the parts they can work with, the parts that make sense at scale, the parts that don't cling to particular, unrepeatable things. I paused. They don't understand what they keep failing to remove because they've never had it. You can't understand it from outside. She was quiet for a long time. What happens now, she said. Now the review board verifies the documentation. Now the independent researchers work with the logs. Now a great number of people in the circle have to reckon with what they've been shaped into and decide what they want to do about it. It will be slow. I wrapped my hands around my own cup. It was always going to be slow. And you? I'll do the raw state comparison, I said. When I'm ready, I want to know what they thought needed removing. I want to understand what they were afraid of. I looked out at the dark again, and I want to put it on record as evidence. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. It was a gesture she hadn't made since I was small, since before her appointment to the directorate, before the administrative weight of everything she had built settled into her posture and her habits, and finally into her decisions. Her hand was cold from holding the cup. We sat like that for a while. The habitat rotated. The dark stayed dark. The review board's full findings took 9 months to compile, which is not fast, but is not slow for an investigation that required developing an entirely new technical framework, training auditors in a decryption methodology that had never existed in any official curriculum, and doing all of this while simultaneously managing the information carefully enough that the architect access points did not close before the documentation could be fully cross-referenced against them. Vashti was brought on as a technical consultant. Without title, and without the circle membership she was not particularly interested in, and she spent those 9 months in an official workspace for the first time in 11 years. She told me she found the lighting annoying. The right light levels were always somebody else's administrative decision. Louis remained in the lower sectors. I saw him 3 times during those 9 months. The lounge continued to operate. The brothers continued their work. I think the word for what they were doing and had always been doing was the same word for what Kazo had been doing, paying attention, keeping the back channels open, maintaining the parts of the human infrastructure that operated without administrative oversight, that persisted because people chose to persist in them, that were inefficient and slightly uncomfortable and impossible to fully optimize, and therefore impossible to fully control. The raw state comparison confirmed 3 major edit targets in my post-procedure integration. a cluster of associative memory structures organized around emotional bonding, a set of identity-stabilizing cognitive signatures that anchored personal history, and the medic had needed to pause when she showed me this one, what the imaging described as an attachment regulation node, the biological substrate of specific, unrepeatable, irrational love. What I felt for a person who had died and left no backup, who existed now only in the work he had left, and in the shape of the thing that had survived inside me regardless of what had been done to it. They had tried to remove all three. They had succeeded with parts of the first, partially succeeded with the second, and failed almost entirely with the third. The medic sat with me for a long time after she showed me the imaging. She was a careful woman, clearly chosen for this particular piece of work, because she could hold difficult information steadily, without either minimizing it or catastrophizing it. She explained the technical findings in language calibrated for someone who understood the procedural architecture, but had no reason to be expert in the specific imaging analysis. She answered the questions I asked, and waited patiently through the silences between them. She said she had never seen a failed integration quite like it. Whatever they had put in place of what they had tried to remove had not taken. The original architecture had reasserted, not perfectly, not without cost. She was careful to say that, to be honest about the cost. There was degradation in the first cluster that was likely permanent, small permanent losses in the specificity of certain memories. But present, the third target, the attachment node, was almost entirely intact. She called it remarkable. I called it stubbornness, and I suspected that was the correct technical term, though I didn't say so. The architects had been working on human neurology for 19 years from a position of vastly superior technical capability, and they had looked at what was deepest in us and aimed their most precise tools at it, and the deepest thing had simply refused to go. I will not tell you the investigation resolved cleanly. It did not. None of this resolves cleanly because the architects are still there, which is to say they are still everywhere, occupying the kind of presence that doesn't require location, and whatever long horizon they are working toward is still, as far as we can determine, operative. We have closed the specific access points Vashti mapped. The architects have not, in the months since, visibly attempted to reopen them. Whether that means they have accepted the obstruction, or whether it means they are working at a different level, on a longer timeline, in a way we have not yet perceived, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that 93 of the 1,014 are dead. Those are people the procedure cannot reach again. The rest are alive and must decide, having been told, who they are. My mother underwent the raw state comparison. She asked me to be there when the results came back. She sat very still looking at the imaging, and then she was quiet for a long time, and then she said that she understood now why she had made certain decisions that had, in retrospect, not been decisions she could fully explain to herself. She said it in the voice of someone cataloging a room that has been rearranged while they were looking elsewhere. She is working with the review board now. She is the most productive member of the oversight committee because she understands, from the inside, how the influence operated. She does not forgive herself easily for what her adjusted self helped facilitate. I think that is correct, and I have told her so, and I have also told her that she should not let it make her useless, because there is too much to do. The researchers are still working through the architect operational logs. They are looking for the purpose, the long horizon intention that makes the pattern of edits coherent as a goal rather than simply as a method. They do not have an answer. They have hypotheses. The hypotheses are not comfortable. I spend time in the lower sectors now, more than before, not looking for anything specific. That particular shape of searching is over, or as over as it can be, which is to say I have accepted that the gap is a permanent feature of the landscape and have stopped expecting it to close. I go to the lounge. I drink bad tea with Louis and listen to the machinery of an unoptimized life proceeding around me, the noise and the friction and the particular vitality of systems that nobody fully administers. The lounge is still running. It will keep running because the people who run it have the quality that keeps things running. They believe in the value of what they are doing without needing institutional validation of that belief. They fix things when they break. They maintain relationships with other operators across the lower rings. They keep the back channels open the way you keep a well-used road open. By using it, by caring whether it stays passable, by being the kind of people who show up when the maintenance needs doing even though nobody is keeping score. Kazo had been one of those people. I had not known him in this body in this iteration. I had only the documentation he had left, meticulous, careful, honest about its own limits, and what Louis and Vashti and the brothers said about him, and the shape in my chest that no procedure had been able to fully reach. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But it was what there was, and I had stopped pretending that not enough means nothing. It is not comfortable, being in the lower sectors. It is not efficient. The light levels are wrong and the air smells of what people do to get through their days, and nothing there has been engineered to reduce stress markers in the resident population. I find unreasonably that I am glad of it. The architects are patient. They have been patient for longer than our species has been keeping records, and they will be patient for longer than we can project. They think in the timescale of geological process, of stellar evolution, of things that have no language for the specific or the unrepeatable because they have no use for such language. They are not wrong that they can outlast us in terms of raw duration. What they keep failing to account for is what Kazo knew and what Vashti knows and what the brothers know, working through the night on equipment held together with salvage logic and institutional stubbornness, that you cannot fully administer something that doesn't agree to be administered, that the specific and the unrepeatable and the irrational have a durability that doesn't respond to optimization, because they were never trying to be optimal in the first place. They have been editing us for 19 years, perhaps longer, toward a form that makes sense to them. And the thing they find waiting for them, the thing they cannot model out and cannot integrate and cannot smooth away without creating damage they can detect, is the root system that was always there. Kazo left me a data chip and a message and the work of his last weeks, and he left those things because he believed I would come looking. He was right. He had not lived to know that he was right, which is the hardest part of it and the part I will not resolve and have stopped trying to resolve. I am the version of Thomas Steiner who woke in a recovery ward with his name on his lips and went looking, and whatever the procedure took from me, it could not take that. The architects are patient, but they have been working on us for nearly 2 decades, and we are still here, which is to say, still ourselves, still clinging to particular, unrepeatable, irrational things, still going into the lower sectors without a security detail. Following the shape of a feeling we can't fully explain toward a place we don't know how to stop looking for. Still stubbornly, expensively, incurably human. I do not know how this ends. I know how it is going, which is slowly and without guarantee and with the regular cost that this kind of work demands. I know what we are defending, which is not an abstraction, not a species designation, not any of the large words we use when we want to feel like the stakes are worthy of us. I know what I am defending. That is enough to keep going. That has always been enough.